water before I tell other people they have to come back. Yes. You can do. Like Emily's is too. But hers is fun. So it's also a little different. A minute here to come back together and finish your conversation and sit down and finish your conversation. Not forever. For now. So again, continue to grab food and snacks, etc. We're going to get started with our next panel. And I am very happy to introduce one of the co-editors of this volume, Rebekah Tromble, professor at George Washington University and director of the aforementioned Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. So please join me. Thank you. I am really happy to be here to launch the book. More than anything, to be in the room with such an amazing group of scholars and friends who are committed to doing work that matters. It really struck me during the first panel this morning that the conversation that the first group of contributors were having about how it is we need to talk about these events, how it is that we need to name the phenomenon, can often feel very ivory tower, right? In fact, we had a question from the audience: how do we get journalists to actually act on these things? But what is really remarkable to me is that in this book, in this edited volume, we've been able to bring together a number of scholars who are committed to going well beyond just speaking to within the ivory. These are folks who care about the impact on the world. And to me, there are fewer topics more important than the impact of January 6th and the political environment, the impact on democracy in the United States at the moment. And of course, I speak about these topics as someone who lives and works and teaches and researches in Washington, D.C. itself. I know that myself and my colleagues from George Washington University can tell you how hard that moment was, not just for us, but especially our students. GW is downtown DC. It is blocks from the White House, a little bit further from the Capitol. And our students really felt the impact of what was happening in the city. I had really hard conversations with my family that day, right? Family who don't see the world the same way I do. And I had to communicate that we were living it and we were scared. And so I just wanted to emphasize that this is a topic that belongs not just in the pages of our journals, the pages of our books, but has to be a larger socio-political discussion. And I'm just thrilled to be among a group of colleagues who are really committed to moving that forward. Now, I'm particularly lucky to get to moderate a panel with 4 of those amazing colleagues who I think are going to speak to issues very much apropos to what I've just suggested. Before I say that, Shannon gave me the instructions, and Shannon, I wrote notes as you were giving your opening, that because there are likely members in the room who were not here for the last session, a quick reminder that we have a number of excellent books available for you to take with you today. And for those who are here, I have no idea what these words mean, but I'm going to say them. Those who are here for CLE credit, you can approach your USC professor and have a QR codes. Thank you very much. I've done my duty. Nor the Constitution. It's my pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists. I'll give very brief introductions and ask each of you to come up in turn. First is Regina Lawrence, who's Associate Dean of the School of Journalism and Communication and Research Director for the Agora Journalism Center at Oregon. Next is Jenny Stromer-Galley. Jenny Stromer-Galley, Senior Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs and Professor. 78 more days. She's not counting down at all. And Professor in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. Next up is Yonghyun Yang, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at Texas A&M and a research affiliate with our Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at GW. And last, but maybe sort of least, my dear friend and colleague, Dave Karp, Associate Professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs and also an affiliated researcher at the Institute for Data. So I've asked the panelists to give some brief opening remarks and have actually given them an order to present these. So Regina, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Rebecca. Thank you. It's so great to be with you all here today, even to talk about such a difficult and challenging time in our nation's history. I'm here on behalf of myself and my colleague, Whitney Phillips, who I hope many of you know. If you don't know of her work, I can't recommend it highly enough. So I really am going to start by just relaying a bit from the chapter that we wrote for this book. And I really have to give credit for the amazing use of metaphor and her abilities. So what we essentially argue in this short chapter is that all of the painstaking efforts by legislators, researchers, journalists, etc., to reconstruct what exactly happened on January 6th are obviously very important. As Shannon and others have said earlier today, folks have to be held accountable for what happened. But the attack on democracy didn't end, of course, on January 6th. It is well aware. And so in order to best understand it and to continue to illuminate what's going on, we need to be thinking about January 6th as a particularly conspicuous moment in a long-standing and ongoing assault on democracy. And we argue that it could be helpful to think about this assault on democracy as a kind of an anti-democratic agribusiness, if you will. And so we play with that metaphor to talk about the soil and environmental conditions that have given rise to the most visible aspects of this phenomenon, which we argue includes the wide and deep and growing networks of domestic extremists, a political landscape that increasingly helps to normalize mainstream, thank you very much, Alice, for that insight, mainstream extremist beliefs and extremist violence. Even among, and here's something I think gets overlooked too often, even among a swath of Americans who themselves are not active members of those groups, who may even have somewhat ambivalent attitudes towards groups. Also the dark money forces that are at work behind the scenes. So we talk about this notion of soil, and we talk about this notion of equipment, like the farm equipment of this agribusiness, so to speak, which of course includes the media that we are here to talk about and to study. And that includes everything from the recommendation algorithms all the way down to the bundling of right-wing channels with people's local, cable customer subscriptions. So we talk about also in answer to or as part of this question talked about during the last panel, how do we think about the Republican Party? I think we can think about the Republican Party as both machinery and soil in a sense, right? The cultivator of anti-democratic action and a fertile ground for anti-democratic belief to become further mainstream. So we think that considered from this perspective, even the most critical legal investigations, like the work of the House Select Committee, that focused on the specifics of who did what on January 6th, may end up sending a somewhat misleading message that identifying individuals who are responsible is enough to sort of save democracy, if you will. And part of what we like about this metaphor of the agribusiness is think about the ongoing production of the crop, right? So that crop has continued to be produced. And even if we've managed to cordon off some of the bad fruits, so to speak, of January 6th, it really didn't slow the agribusiness down very much at all. In fact, it may have helped to fuel it in certain kinds of ways. So we just are simply making a sort of a plea for all of us, an invitation for all of us to focus on what is still happening, focus on what is leading us into the near future in terms of the next election, to emphasize the present and the future tense nature of the anti-democratic activism. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's perfect. I really, really love that metaphor, and I think it's a beautiful way to segue from the discussion about how we talk about these things to widen the scope just a little bit to almost how we think about them, right? What's the larger metaphor? I think it's really powerful. Thank you, and Whitney. Jenny.
I need to thank my collaborators on this, Brian McKernan, who's at PACE, and two doctoral students who helped slog through thousands of tweets and Facebook posts and ads by the presidential candidates of Christy Curry and Pyongyang Kim. I probably don't need to tell this audience that communication matters, right? The prior talked about the importance of words and how words matter. But I think it is important to continue to reflect a little bit on how communication mattered in the lead up to the attack on January 6th, the coup on January 6th. So we argue in our book chapter that Trump's claim that the election would be stolen laid the groundwork for members of the public to mistrust the election results, which in turn created the conditions for the attack on the Capitol. And as I hinted at, our conclusions are based on extensive close reading. I once had an editor say to me, how do you do close readings of tweets? But when you read 3,000 of them, they get kind of so we looked at Trump's messaging. We also looked at Biden's messaging. So when rioters attacked the Capitol on January 6th, they did so with the mistaken belief that the electoral process was fraudulent. And they believed that Trump had been robbed of confidence. So epistemic philosophy, so this is like Berger and Levin, Taylor advanced the idea that knowledge is socially constructed. And as Taylor explains, our understanding of democracy today is based on a groundwork laid over 3 centuries with a big asterisk around the execution of that democracy being, of course, deeply problematic. But the philosophy, if you will, the normative underpinning grounded in Locke and Rousseau and others of a social imaginary of the people having a natural right to self-govern. And that elections become the source for that legitimate power through the electoral expression of the vote. And that's the core tenet of this social imaginary that's embraced in our governance structure. But the social imaginary is not a given. And without continued, you see if I can do this right, without continued, I still can't do it, continued ritualistic reaffirmation of the people as self-governed through the exercise of the vote, the core tenet of democracy. And we argue that Trump's rhetoric during and after the election aimed to undermine that ritualistic affirmation, thereby putting our entire system of governance. So Trump began advancing this argument well before the election. As early as the beginning of April of 2020, he started attacking the voting process. It is important to remember, and we haven't mentioned this yet, which I'm surprised by, COVID mattered to this election. You might remember that we were in the thick of the presidential primaries when COVID began to spread in March through the country. And so legislatures across the country had to pass quick policy changes to allow for mail-in balloting and absentee balloting, ballot boxes that people could drop their ballots into. And this dramatic shift in the process around voting further opens up lines of attack by Trump around the electoral process. So our analysis of Trump's social media messages during the campaign suggests that Trump used this, of course, his heavily followed social media accounts to portray an imaginary that the election was deeply fallible, that there would be problems with accuracy of the vote count. And he made these arguments repeatedly and intensely through the election period. So he insinuated, for example, through his social media messages, an unnamed they that were going to take and disenfranchise Trump. He accused Democrats, the Democratic Party, Democratic governors, Democratic mayors, even his opponent, Joe Biden, of attempting to steal the election. He engaged in repeated unfounded attacks on Dominion, which is an electoral voting system. I remember this being effectively sued Fox News for defamation. So by contrast, when you look at Biden's ads, posts, and tweets, you see a very different kind of message around the election. He urged the public to vote using any available means. He urged people to make a plan, to vote by mail, by absentee, by in-person balloting. And unlike Trump's arguments, Biden didn't differentiate or deprecate one form of voting over another. Instead, what he did is underscore the sovereign right, underscoring this imaginary that all Americans have the right and should exercise that right to vote. So our analysis suggests that Biden and Trump provides competing imaginaries of the vote. Biden's rhetoric portrays an image of America where the democratic process of voting is sacred. In contrast, Trump's rhetoric portrays an image of America where democratic institutions have been completely corrupted. The electoral process cannot be trusted, and true Americans exert their will through anti-democratic means. So Trump's rhetorical imaginary created a collective grievance among his supporters that ultimately found expression through violent death.
In reading your piece, there were a couple. First, all sympathy, strength to the agency, all of those tweets and the ads and so on. But I really appreciate that you use this term tongue twister that may be right ritualistic affirmation, because I think so often, particularly in political communication, we tend to focus on the notion of repetition being powerful as the orientation technique, because at the individual level it makes it sticky. Right? It creates memory for us, when in fact we miss this element of the social, right? The ritual element of this is social, sociological, and is probably just as impactful and powerful as repetition through memory creation. Yeah. So that was one thing that really stood out to me. Okay, you go next.
Thank you. The title of my book chapter is Rethinking Right-Wing Media in the Wake of an Attempted Coup. As we know, many right-wing media outlets played a big role in spreading the big lie and fueling the January 6th insurrection. After the insurrection, some right-wing media whitewashed it, attacked the January 6th House Select Committee, and continued to sow doubts about elections. These recent developments suggest that right-wing media are taking a unique political role in the MAGA movement and Republican Party politics, one that is perhaps not well explained by what I characterize as a partisan media framework in the field of political communication. A lot of previous scholarship in our field has focused on identifying and analyzing ideological or partisan bias. They show that, for example, right-wing media select stories that favors GOP, and they put a conservative spin on news. This approach often compares Fox News to MSNBC as if they are the two sides of the same coin. However, this value-neutral approach overlooks the critical question of whether Fox and MSNBC are indeed comparable in terms of how they operate and their role in American democracy. MSNBC, in my view, is a biased but fact-based and editorially independent news organization. But do Fox and other right-wing media really operate as biased but fact-based and editorially independent news organizations? they certainly want us to believe that or treat them that way. For example, Breitbart's editor-in-chief, Alex Marlow, once told a journalist from the New York Times in an interview that, quote, "Our bias now comes in story selection. We're not going to cover the Russia scandal as much as we are covering the cartels coming over the border." Many right-wing media also claim on their website that they are fact-based and editorially independent, and some of them claim that they have conflict of interest policy. But this characterization, which portrays many right-wing media as news organizations, the fourth estate of democracy, I believe is wrong. My book chapter proposed a new way to look at right-wing media. I argue that they function as political organizations which use disinformation and other tools to advance strategic political objectives, such as influencing voters and disrupting political processes. In the opening of my book chapter, I presented an example. On January 7th, 2021, one day after insurrection, the front page story of One American News Network, OANN, is actually not a front page story. It is a fundraising page for Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Matt Gaetz, Louis Gohmert, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. All of them had just voted to overturn the 2020 election result. Another example I presented in the book chapter is that Breitbart and the Daily Caller took money from the National Republican Congressional Committee to help it fundraise for Josh Hawley and Kelly Loeffler during the 2020 election. In fact, almost with a few exceptions, almost every major right-wing media outlet has done this in the past decade, including Newsmax, Daily Wire, Western Journal, and etc. In a new book that I just finished, I will present a systematic analysis of all the payment exchanges between GOP super PACs and right-wing media in the past decade. It shows that right-wing media were closely involved in GOP campaigns, taking PACs and super PACs money while reporting on their candidates. So I think given the empirical evidence and also our normative commitment to defending and protecting American democracy, we rethink right-wing media and their role in American democracy in the wake of the January 6th insurrection.
Thank you, y'all, how lucky am I that he was one of the first, were you very first postdoc? Second postdoc at IDDP, right? That we had the pleasure of working directly with you together. I don't think I need to say much for you to understand how powerful the work that Young-Ping has been doing is. The first time that you told me that you had this, this theory of right-wing media as political organizations, my thought was, well, yeah, that makes sense, but how are we going to prove it, right? And what you have done is such an incredible systematic analysis that demonstrates these connections, and I think without a shadow of a doubt, makes it clear that the sort of balanced notion that these are just, as you put it, bias, yes, or news organizations with biases, but it's just a bias on the other side of the coin. Balancing what we've always seen before is frankly a little bullshit. And that you have been able to bring this sort of evidence to the table is really, really helpful. So thank you for your work. Dave.
I want to know, the work on this volume started with a joint conference we did. That was what?
It was the one on the 1 year anniversary.
So January
22.
2022. And I want to note that because the thing that I'm fixated on in my chapter in terms of inventing the next day. And when I was first writing around that, that felt far off, as sort of a far off, let's not go there. And I feel like that, at least for me, that frames it different now, because it's like, oh, you mean next year. So I'm worried that I'm more worried now. The thing I'm primarily a lead here. The thing that I'm trying to raise in the chapter, the idea that unless there are consequences, not just for the rioters who invaded the Capitol, but for the people who there's a little fixated on John Eastman, who has, I think he's now been disbarred, and he's still
Yes.
looking at jail. Back when I was writing that, John Eastman had, a few months before that, been invited to present at the APSA conference. And not by APSA, but by the Claremont Institute, because the Claremont Institute was an affiliated organization of APSA, and they had one in general. If you're not familiar with the Claremont Institute, there's been some great journalism. They used to be a conservative but legitimate political theory association of conservative theorists that during the Trump years started arguing that actually, since we don't win in democratic elections shouldn't exist anymore because they aren't good for the American. They are the leading set of scholars and interpreters of Trumpism trying to legitimate, and publish on their website plenty of absurdly racist. They had invited him, and I did a little campaigning with fellow political scientists to get them invited. They're no longer part of the chaos. But the broader point I was trying to make there, like, I'm sorry, proud that they're not an APSA. I don't think that hurts much. And if they do not feel pain, if they only gain profit from the actions of January 6th, then of course we should expect more. Right? If the actions of January 6th lead Josh Hawley to fundraise more money and increase his profile, we should expect not only Josh Hawley, but others in the Senate to say, oh, that is what our party wants. We talked before the break a little bit about Liz Cheney. It would have been great if she had come here. I'm glad we didn't spend 100 time. But a related question there, this isn't in the chapter, but I think it's a riff that we should be. Ziblatt and Levitsky, who comparative scholars who've written a lot on this, have presented the template of democracy, the need to build common cause with modern republics, with these institutionalist republics. In theory, I fully agree with you. And then there's the added practical problem of how much do you do to bring them on board, given how few of them there are. So part of the problem that I'm really trying to get into in the chapter, and years ago, I think it matters a lot that every elected Republican who has decided to be a bit of an institution, stand up at all to Donald Trump, has now left. But it matters quite a bit that the RNC is now run by Laura Trump. Because that means that the Republican Party is entirely right now party of Trump. And we as scholars and also, I mean, journalists and public intellectuals, like all of us, want to grope for the idea that there must be some part of the party coalition that is pushing back, either loudly or quietly, and that Trumpism is an anomaly. And we must make common cause with them so that we can finally go back to being a democracy where democracy is a system of government where party can lose elections. Yes, that is absolutely where we need to get. And also we should be honest about the fact that right now there are so few of them in the Republican Party. There aren't a lot of strategic sacrifices we should be making to bring like, they don't actually bring that much. So another one of the themes that I'm trying to make in the chapter is that only the Republican Party can fix it. I'm a little professor in Washington. Everybody who can like follow me on social media can tell what party I vote for. Party network isn't going to change based on the direct criticism or anyone in this room. But for American democracy to keep going, you're going to need either systemic reform that ain't happening, or we're going to need a Republican Party that fixes it. We can talk in Q&A about how that happens. I have some hunches that are like almost optimistic, like as close as I get, at least.
Yeah.
That's the key point that I think we want to sit with right now, is that the reason why next January 6th rather likely is that, well, Rudy Giuliani lost that, he now owes what, 70 million or so? It didn't go great for him. Donald Trump has faced a bunch of lawsuits, but most of them managed not to actually face for the election because there are members of the court and other institutions that decide to stand in the way of the ballot. So long as there are not elite consequences, so long as being Liz Cheney, you are out of the first. As long as being Matt Gaetz means, great, you're a star of it. We should expect one of the two parties in a two-party system be a party of Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump. Of course, that's not going to last in a democracy. There have to be elite consequences to that. They have to decide we can't keep doing this. Bad for us. Either because we lose elections or because we don't get invited to the parties. Like if they face consequences on concepts, I think that matters too. So that's instinct of sort of an organizer. Come at everything through the lens of an organizer, right? That instinct of power and pressure and figuring out what is going to motivate us. We need that in mind because only the Republican Party can fix the Republican Party. And right now, the members of it who are institutionalists, there's like two.
Ending on the optimistic note.
No, that's for
you know.
Q&A. Ask them for Q&A if they want me.
All right. One thing that I want to say to Dave and about your work, again, I've been really lucky that for the last 5 years, my door has been in the office has been directly next to Dave's. And so we've had a lot of strange conversations over the years, but Dave has really shaped, and this chapter is part of that, has really shaped my thinking as a political scientist on what institutions and what norms actually mean. Right? I think that we have, as a field, we have fallen back far too much on the assurance that norms matter, and that in fact, norms are more powerful than they have now proven to be, right? When it comes down to sort of brass tacks, how can you get the money in the bank account? And it turns out that the way you get the money in the bank account is by doing things that crumble institutions and push against norms that people. And trying to find the practical ways we deal with that is really, really important. So I've said a few words after each of these presentations about how I've thought each of these chapters. In no small part because our theme for this panel is researching threats to democracy. And the work that each of you has done has really had an impact on the way that I think about the research that I do. And so I want us to start off pulling on that theme just a little bit more, and then later in our discussion, I think probably going to, so essentially starting off thinking about how do we speak to other researchers with our work? What are our calls to our colleagues in the field? And then later move to think a little bit more broadly about who are we as researchers and what are our responsibilities in the larger world. So starting with that first element, one of the things that I found really impressive in each one of these chapters is that you each interrogate work that's gone before, each identify concepts, theories, and so on that you think are problematic, that researchers in our field spend too much time focusing on or too little. So I wanted to ask each of you what thoughts you have about where are we putting the wrong emphasis, either too much emphasis or too little emphasis, and what are the consequences of that in your thinking?
I have a long-standing bit, like dating back 12 years, focusing on ceteris paribus assumptions, and when we like ceteris paribus is what we may see all these people in the room. Hey, look, wow, he looked. Ceteris paribus, all else being. That we have a habit in the research community of assuming that this election must be like other elections, which allows us to conduct our study and feel that it is comparable to all of it. But, and I think that has led us not to take seriously the ways that the Republican Party is changing and think. This is back in 2016, I was at a political communication pre-conference talking about the study of that weird election. And there was a scholar who I'm not going to call out now, but it was basically like, I'm analyzing the tweets and the campaign communication. Trump's campaign communications are no different than anybody else's. Like, it's just another election, like all the other elections. And I was like, I don't know, this seems a little different to me in ways that might matter. In particular, and look, everybody who contributed to this volume is convinced that January 6th was a fracturing enough event that we should take it seriously. That's not something that is universally believed. And that always is puzzling to me because, again, like I sometimes feel like I need to shout at fellow political scientists, again, not the ones that if they stop having elections, what are the things you're studying? Like, if you were a scholar of like campaign commercials and they stop having campaigns, what do you study? You should be a little worried about the fate of democracy just professionally. But I think that instinct to interrogate our own ceteris paribus assumption, say, what are the ways that this case that I'm studying now is similar to the ones that we were used to theorizing about? And what are the elements that actually need to get re-looked at now? Because while we don't want to like assume that every election is completely new and different than we would just be pundits, we ought to at least ask, is there something going on here that challenges the way or unsettles the way we usually study things? And maybe point our attention towards the new and the different. Because that's where I think we can do the most.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments. I think that in answer to the question, what are we a little too focused on? I think we have been very focused on information, obviously. And I think that really needs to be answered by, balanced out by, complemented by, not really thinking so much about information. And I two thoughts here. One is that I really appreciate how some of the chapters in this book, Tony Nadler's chapter, the work that Dana has done, Johnson's work in this book, are really pointing us toward stuff that's not so much information, it is narrative. It is the deep stories, as Harley Bushield and others have that we need to understand, I think, not just what information people are maybe grabbing on, being exposed to, and then, taking up and coming to believe, but what is the grand story that they see themselves helping to enact? What is the grand story they think is playing out in the country that they are historically involved in, right? Like, what movie do you in? And I think that could really complement our focus on disinformation. And I think there's another element there, because when we focus on disinformation, we automatically then necessarily are focused on, those people that might support or come to support this anti-democratic movement. We focus on the people who perpetrated January 6th, et cetera, and we have to do that work for sure. But today's discussions have really got me thinking about the much larger swath of Americans that don't support that. Probably don't know or understand very much about it, but don't support it. What's the grand narrative for them? What's the grand narrative that that most Americans can see themselves in? And it seems to me that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to kind of remind or provide anew stories of democracy in a way that are really meaningful, even with all of democracy's many shortcomings in this country. I think we need to connect with grand narratives that can somehow address the crisis.
I really like that. It strikes me that takes us in important ways away from focus on fact checking, on media framing, right, into the world of stories and brand narratives and understanding the more systemic role that these, right, individual messages play within the larger systemic narrative.
I'll pick up on that because the hard part is that first there's no single one thing you point to say, that's why we got to January 6th. There it is, that's the thing. Right? It's a complex set of things. And this is one of the hard parts when you're a social scientist, right? You want to be able to develop the theory, test the theory, collect the data, right? But there's certain things that are bigger than a social scientist can really get their arms around. You know, so because it's a system, it's a set of events and situations and actors that sort of led up to that moment and then will continue afterwards. You know, so imagine, for example, that the economic collapse didn't happen in 2008, right? So we have, as was predicted and has happened, the economic recovery in the United States following that economic collapse has been very slow and it has been very bifurcated, right? So if you are wealthy, if you have stock, right, you're in good shape. If you're working paycheck to paycheck, you still today are being hurt by the economic consequences that started back in 2008. If we hadn't had that global economic collapse, maybe the economics would be different, such that people wouldn't have the activated narratives that Trump pushed, for example. Imagine that Obama did it. Right? So the kind of the coalescing of people saying, I don't understand how we have a Black president, activating racial tension, identities, coalescing against the first Black president. You know, imagine we didn't have preppers. My dad was a prepper. You know what I mean when I say that? Right? Remember the TV shows about prepping? Right? We political communication people, we never pay attention to pop culture. Why? We should be. There is all kinds of things happening in pop culture around being ready for, right, this massed armed revolution that will ultimately take us because our economy is going to collapse. These bad people are going to take over our country, and we're going to have to make this happen. So everybody, get your bunkers, get your guns, get your gold, and you know, your pantry of canned goods, because the revolution is coming and we better be ready for that, right? So pop culture, we pay no attention to that, we should. The technological shift, imagine we didn't have Twitter. Would Donald Trump have gotten elected in 2016 without Twitter? So, you know, you mentioned, for example, the regulatory environment, 100%, but the platforms themselves, right, are playing huge roles in this. And so trying to get your arms around all of those different things, to be able to say it's not one thing, it's a whole set of things. It's the public imaginary, it is the economic system, it is our pop culture, it is this fetishization around guns and revolution and fighting against, it's racism activated over and over and over again. All of those things, right, kind of culminate into this. And it's damn hard to point to as a social scientist and say, there it is.
Indeed. And Kim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, for me, I think 2 points. I think there's a lot of perhaps too much emphasis on the conservative bias of right-wing when people analyze right-wing. I think they do have a lot of bias, but I think they also, part of what they do is no longer really conservative or sort of bias, no longer that. I think it's going beyond what is conservatism mean, what does conservatism mean, and what is bias in terms of biased news coverage. Second point is that I think there's a lot of emphasis on studying content, because right-wing media, we believe that they are media organizations. Of course, what media organizations do is they publish content, right? But if we change our thinking and start to think about them as political organizations, then we might want to pay attention to other kinds of activities they do. For example, the offline coordination with dark money groups and Republican operatives, right? And also how decisions get made internally within that organization. Right? Is there really editorial independence, or did the owners and managers of right-wing media dictate what they cover and how to cover them in key elections or about key candidates? The Dominion voting machine versus Fox settlement revealed a lot about what happened behind the scenes within Fox. Rupert Murdoch acknowledged that he, suggested or pushed editors and journalists, reporters at Fox News to tilt the coverage towards certain GOP candidates. So there is evidence there, but I admit that to get that kind of evidence is really hard. They don't want researchers like us to do an ethnography or participate observation within their organization. But I think it is really important to get that kind of ease.
To add one thing to that, and I'm going to say your work in this book and the book that you have coming out is an exception to it. But I was really struck reading through all of these chapters that maybe we've been focused too much on media. Because actually, if you read a lot of these chapters, they don't talk very much about media, interestingly, because I think of what Jenny, Dave, all of us are kind of saying, the situation is much bigger and media are playing very important roles in various ways. But is that really what is that what our central focus should really be on? The human methodologies for grappling with these much larger, more complex issues.
Well, that's it. We're done for the day. No more media democracy. January 6th. No, I think that's a really good point. And how do we, how do we conceptualize what media are that are relevant here? I think we often fall back on the now tired and not at all full distinction between traditional mass media and social media and digital platforms and so on. But how do we think about them as part of these larger communication ecosystems and larger information ecosystems, right? Even just beyond the traditional organization that we tend to think of. I want to shift to the discussion just a little bit and ask you all what you think our responsibilities as scholars are in this space. We come up through graduate programs that traditionally teach us to focus on the empirics, right? To gather data, analyze that data, share facts, to ground it all in larger theories. And in some instances, and particularly with some advisors, we're encouraged to speak to wider audiences and engage with the wider world. But quite frankly, that's not the overall emphasis most of the time. So where do you think our responsibilities lie? Are they to science and inquiry first and foremost? Are they to democracy, to wider society? Are they to specific principles, equity and inclusion, for example? How do we navigate these potentially different roles that we have as teachers and scholars?
I was just going to make a snotty comment, which is that the institution, right, higher education, we are incentivized to get tenure, right? And the tenure incentivization means that things like working with journalists, spending that time, somebody mentioned this earlier, the amount of time it takes to just help journalists, talk and help teach journalists how to understand time. That's a lot of time. You can't put that on your resume and say, look, I got another thing, give me tenure. So we have a problem with the incentive structure in higher education for faculty types like us don't facilitate or don't support things like what you do, which is working with these organizations in ways. Now, you've managed to be very successful nevertheless, but I think it's a challenging situation. You think about, I'm sure there's some PhD students in the room or aspiring PhD students in the room. And that's one of the things I think is it's a failure of higher education to not honor, recognize, value the work that we should be doing, and working with journalists, working with organizations, with our government actors, which Rebekah does beautifully, right? But that you have to be in the right position for that to be honored and recognized as important. So shame on us in higher education for not recognizing that we have many different values we can provide to society. But in terms of the career track, right, the only thing that matters in the end is grants and publication.
And I would just quickly add to that, the increasing expectation, junior faculty, straight out of the PhD programs, that you're supposed to have X number of peer review already, which I think is really undermining, robbing people of their opportunity in graduate school to do what graduate school should be for.
Absolutely.
Which is the deeper thinking, the broader reading, that, you know, the one time in your life where you may have a little more time and focus to synthesize them broadly and think big. And I think that's not being in many.
And can I just note, I you know, the fact that we're here in North Carolina, given some of the things that happen in the state, even to this particular institution, I also get concerned about the, you know, what's okay for us to even be saying in these organizations, in these institutions, because of the political structures that we currently reside within. You know, again, if you're a junior faculty member or a PhD student, I mean, it's, you know, you potentially are sacrificing things if you decide to be active and to speak out. I mean, we're no better than journalists when we try to pick our words so that we're not offending certain constituencies that are stakeholders for us. I'm sorry, I'm on the soapbox, I'll stop. I don't know what came over me. Righteous indignation, I don't know what the hell it is.
I want to piggyback off of that righteous indignation just a little bit. Here, and many of you in this room, right, know that I've been doing work for over a year now with scholars who are close colleagues and friends of so many of us who are facing coordinated campaigns of intimidation and harassment right now. One of the terms that is being used very actively, I heard multiple times at Heritage Foundation event just two days ago, was referring to those of us who do this work as pseudoscience, right? So really trying to go at that core claim that we're often asked to fall back on, which is that we study facts, we study the empirics, we speak about truth, not just opinion, but that when we convey particular norms and values, it is moving away from the science, right? It's really sort of latched onto that and are using, and I very much suspect, right, we're all going to have to get used to pushing back against this claim of pseudoscience going forward. I wonder how you would react to that. How would you push back against that, you yourself or your colleague being referred to as?
I remember the first lesson of framing, perhaps, which is you wouldn't want to reinforce the frame by get in an argument with people who don't understand or respect science about what science is. So I don't know. I'm glad you're asking. Steve?
When I occasionally have conversations about this, I again approach things kind of as an organizer. There are a set of opponents who mean us harm, and so I would want to figure out what our goals are, what their goals are, what their needs are, and find ways to help. I mean, like that. I think it is important to start by recognizing that what's happening is a campaign to discredit academia and knowledge itself, so that they, which means that we don't treat like that. My favorite academic was and right.
Like how?
So there's a bit in the semi-soft. In Semi-Sovereign People where he mentions,
Can you say louder who it was?
oh, E. Schatzsnyder. This, SCHATTSCHNEIDER. First name is E.E, because if you're an Elmer, you would go by E. So he has a bit, okay, so the Semi-Sovereign People basically invents framing theory in the mid-1960s, a couple decades before the field of publication existed or framing theory existed. Like, that dude's a legend. E. Schatzsnyder, in that book, look, now we're getting me started. I won't play on that. In that book, he has this wonderful passage that I teach my students, where he notes that political debate is not like, or like political contestation is not like an intercollegiate debate, where the terms have been agreed upon. The articulation of terms is the point. He's already in the 60s, so he uses he as a general reason. He who sets the terms of the debate will post power. That, by the way, is not a direct quote. I'm going to note it by myself, not getting it word for word. So you all will permit that or go read the book. It's great. So again, what we want to be focusing on there, conflict theory, Schatzsnyder, that approach is the Heritage Foundation is trying to exercise an agenda. What we want to do is understand why they are taking shots at us, and then try to formulate a strategy as supporters and allies to one another to fight back. Like, one of the worst things we can do is say, as scholars, we are going to demonstrate how non-pseudoscience we are by being above the fray and just doing our science. That's a bit like the journalists who early in the Trump years said, we are going to, like, who was it, Marty Barron, who said he thinks we're at war, we're at work. It's like, lovely turn of phrase, Marty Barron. I have news for you, though. If somebody declares war on you, you don't get to just say, no, 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 it's not war. If someone has declared war on you, you are at war whether you like it or not. So I would much prefer that the Heritage Foundation and certain members of Congress not declare war on us. That's also bad for society. It's bad on so many levels. But they're going to declare war on us, then I would say, okay, then this is unfortunate. We are at war, and therefore we're going to strategy.
Let me take one half step back in this conversation. So, Regina, as you pointed out, you don't win a framing war, right, by trying to counter argue. Dave, you're speaking to the sort of larger audience for all of this. What about when the audience is our funders and our administrators would like us to be saying, but we won't say those scary words anymore. We won't talk about things like equity, inclusion. We won't even talk about democracy, right? What we will do is the science, we promise, and we'll put ourselves out there as the scientists. What do we say to our funders and our administrators?
I think we make clear what the stakes are here, right? Like what they most want is for this to go away. And I get it. Like if I was this is a joke that I used to make around the Brett Stevens thing, but aside, but because for those of you who don't know, but anyway, like Provost got thing that I wanted to point out is like,
boy, did they ever.
And it was on the first day of the semester. And so one thing that I was aware of is like, the provost does not know who I am before the email comes in. And if I'm in the provost's shoes, like, that's not what I wanted my week to do. Right? And in the same way, like when this is coming up, part of what they're exercising is like, oh man, like now the Heritage Foundation is coming after a bunch of my, like, I didn't want to have to deal with this. Can I not deal with this, please? And while it's work and it doesn't help that universities are never well run and therefore they're not going to do a good job of it, doing the internal work of making clear to them, here is what's at stake here. And I know that this is frustrating for you, but like, let's be clear on what story, again, like what story is being told. And while you didn't want this role in it, the role that you're not now playing. Same with our funders. Like, I can understand funders deciding that they would rather not have to deal with this noise. And like, they have, board members or other people in their cocktail party circuit who they would rather this all just go away. And their instinct is going to be, okay, we just won't fund this anymore, and that way it'll go away. It's then on us to do let's be clear, very hard work of convincing them that that is not the story they're in. They're in a story where there's an attack on the production of knowledge itself. That attack won't stop if they give them what they want, because they aren't actually upset about this thing. They've got a broader project. And therefore, they're going to need to stand up and be allies. And the good news is that's actually courageous, which is just a ton of work also. And it sucks to do it. There we go.
I want to note before I turn it over to the audience for questions, that most of this last part of the conversation, right, it's been senior scholars who've been remarking. Young King, I'm not putting you on the spot to ask you to say we don't want to, but I also want to create space. I think there's something that's missing in this discussion that the senior scholars with tenure, who are relatively protected here, are mentioned.
Yeah, well, I work at Texas A&M University. No, something happened last year, so I think that it's a challenging political environment, and because I am like many others, a junior scholar, so we don't really get much involved in the decision making process at the university or college level. What I do know is what I hear from my senior colleagues and the leadership at our department. So there was recently a piece out that singled out my colleagues at my department at Texas A&M University using very old as book professor, that kind of thing. It's not at the level that you experienced. But I think, I wasn't targeted, so I wasn't. But I think my colleagues turned out to be overall fine. Some of them, I mentioned that they were confronted by people in their community, especially with their kids, which is really bad. In addition to that, nothing worse happened.
And I also just, want to lift up and recognize the fact that it's relatively safe for some of us to talk about these things, and much less so for others. And so especially when we're calling for, us to take stands and public stands on these, we also have to be mindful of the blowback effects that those can have on other people, and really emphasize the community in all of this, right? Much more so than the individual moving forward.
Can I add do you have an idea? Can I make a riff on that too?
Yeah, of course.
Which is, this white dude, fellow tenure cis white dudes. Given our identity-based resilience, you should be standing in front and taking forward. Like, again, I briefly mentioned the breath. I got 0 death threats during that breath. 0.
Wow.
Wow.
What does a white dude need to do to buy a death threat?
You can have some of mine.
Yeah.
And this is a point to be aware of, is part of allyship is also being aware of there is things would be worse for my colleagues than for me. And particularly if you're well protected and comfortable, that means that there's extra stepping up to do as an adult.
So, what questions do you have for all of us? Please.
Yeah, I teach here at UNC School of Journalism and Media. My question is for those individuals who believe in democracy, though may not have any conscious sense that they are fighting for democracy, but who believe in it in principle. What is the best strategy to activate those people who actually go to the polls and vote?
I want to note temporality, right? Voting isn't until November. One of the obnoxious things, as you told me, but an obnoxious thing about American elections. Well, but like there isn't actually anything we can do there's not a message that will get people to go vote right now because they can't vote. Right now we are kind of, that is like, there's a civic importance to elections, but we actually don't lose it for elections. I do think it seemed pretty clear to me, though I'm not up to date if there's been published research otherwise, that a thing that ended up mattering a bit in 2022 was the secretaries of state that ran on a platform of, I'm going to overturn democracy because there isn't a legitimate election where Donald Trump doesn't win. And they ran on that platform. Organizations made clear the stakes there. And there was a debate at the time as to whether putting democracy on the ballot would actually resonate. And at least it seems as though it is. But again, like part of why I want to point out temporality is if you were shouting about how democracy is on the ballot right now, very loudly, there's actually a bit of risk that people will tune that out because they will have been hearing that from you for several months. There'll be a sense of like, you're always saying that, and yet nothing changes. When the answer is, yeah, no, our elections are too long. It's been at risk these whole 6 months without any voting. But I would expect, or I would certainly hope, assuming that their campaign operations find that resonates, I would expect in the closing months of the election to make clear that the anti-democratic rhetoric is real. We should be treating it both literally and seriously. And the hope is that enough of the American electorate takes that seriously to want to democracy. If they realize
Get abortion on the ballot. You know, that's one obvious driver that's bringing younger voters to the polls. It's very similar to the tactic that's happening in 2012, Republicans putting gay marriage on the ballot as, again, an effort to try to draw anti-LGBTQ policy voters to those. You know, it's the same tactic of push on the ballot and people will vote, and that is good stuff.
But brief response. So there was a very high-profile fundraiser recently. President Clinton, President Obama, and President Biden all attended. I wish George W. Bush and also other prominent Republicans that support democracy, and I wish that fundraiser can take place near the election day. I think that will send a strong signal that Republicans and Democrats are standing together supportive.
I want to chime in to that same point. That to me is what's essential. What makes me uncomfortable in all these conversations is the notion that it is the Democrats stand for democracy. Like the idea of polarizing, like making democracy into a person. In the same way that I hate, no offense, the yard signs that say like, it has no home here, science is real, and it puts science with all the other stuff. I just think the politicization of things like science or democracy, I feel like that's bad. So, you know, thinking about creative ways to work with journalists about just really covering what civics are and how institutions work and educating people on what democracy is and what it requires, as opposed to democracy. It's the thing the Democrats are running. I'm just gonna leave that there.
Well, and like Shannon was just earlier today, that you were pointing out that at least for some number of Americans now, the very word democracy has become politicized, become associated with the political left, civil, et cetera. That's really hard territory. Like, how are we going to navigate that territory? So I tend to agree with Dana. You have to figure out some sort of common ground, which obvious and like well done, but we have to figure out some sort of common ground around basic democratic institutions and norms.
But if it's already happened, like this is like someone's declared war on you and you're like, we're just working, like, we don't have a choice. Like, you know what I mean? It's saying like, well, we'll just be nice and nonpartisan about this because there are partisan attacks, you know what I mean? And I don't think that like, I mean, I agree, in theory, you know what I mean? But I don't know that we have the power to.
I know the genie is out of the box. I get what
Yeah.
you're saying. However, I also think a lot of it is about framing. And I do think that if you are in under the hood talking about what democratic processes are, what democratic institutions are, literally talking about how here are some of the things that Trump has said that he's willing to do. And here's how those things are violations of democratic precedent, democratic norms, as opposed to the Democrats are the party that's going to protect democracy. It just feels like that might be a better way to go about it.
Can it be both? Because people have to do something on November, whatever, I won't remember the date because I'm just living in fear of it. Right? Like, people have to do something.
Love you too.
Their messaging.
Love you too. We've got a comment in the back, question in the back.
I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna help at all here, but I feel like the science is always been politicized, right? I mean, if we think about what the academy is, I always think about like, you know, white men at the University of Salamanca in Oxford discussing whether or not indigenous people have soul. Yeah. And like whether or not they are human and how, you know, whiteness gets invented in the kind of very premise of like the university and like in what we mean by science, what we mean by, you know, how are butterflies different from dogs in the same ways that white people are different from black people, right? Like, so I don't,
Be objective when it agrees with white supremacy.
Say that again.
Science only gets political neutrality when it agrees with white supremacy.
Yes, and in fact, science gets built upon white supremacy.
Yeah.
Our understandings of what is true and what is not true gets built on the understanding of what is white and what is black in like both racial lenses and what is in terms of what we understand as objectivity. So I guess I'm just saying what the right is really good at is understanding our weaknesses in terms of the things that we avoid, that the kind of things, kind of investments we have, particularly in neutrality and the notions of objectivity, and that we have our own house of cards. So what they're good at is saying, no, actually, we're gonna knock down this thing that you say that we all pretend we all know what it means, and we're gonna redefine it. So democracy is one of those things. Like, what do we even mean by democracy? And this is like one of those things that I'm constantly myself trying to read around because I don't think we do such a good job of defining what that is and where we get those terms from and what that means in terms of our imagining of the American public. And I also don't think we do a good job of talking about like social theory and like political theory in ways that like aren't abstractions. So and because they become an abstraction that gets deployed by us in certain ways, and when I say us, I mean people who kind of contend that they believe in a multiracial progressive democracy, like it's really vulnerable. And I think it's our kind of fear of grappling with the ways in which we built up these abstractions that make.
Thank you for that. Any other questions, thoughts, reactions? By the way, very, very much welcome this having turned into a larger conversation, right? Not just Q&A with the panelists. So if we want to keep that up.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you can start that. You can start that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And it's precisely, I think this is the way these sorts of things are most effective. So just wanted to put it out there that as the moderator, I'm very much encouraging this dynamic to continue. Please, the woman in pink.
I really enjoyed this discussion. I have a question about research-oriented things. Do you think the threats to democracy that we're discussing also threatens the relationship between academic and non-academic organizations that facilitate research to safeguard democracy?
Give an example, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about like how Reddit, Twitter provide really important findings to understanding sociocultural phenomena that relate to how we understand democracy and how it's changed over the past years. And you mentioned also how like inner workings of right-wing media organizations are very difficult to get access to. So I'm imagining or hypothesizing that that relationship is only going to strain further. I wanted to ask that experience, how it affects your ability to produce the research that aligns with values.
Everyone should join the Coalition for Independent Tech Research.
Ooh, what? Say louder.
Coalition for Independent Tech Research.
We're doing a lot of the work there.
I don't know what's upstream and what's downstream in your like in this model, but the thing I want to note is like I always thought it was noteworthy. There was a piece I wanted to write and I didn't get around to. Facebook suspended Trump after January 6th. But I think at least as importantly, they suspended him just after the evening of January 5th. Because the evening of January 5th is when two Democrats won Senate special election in Georgia, and the Democrats became in charge of the Senate. Which means, as a practical matter, if you are Facebook as an organization, and you are asking yourselves, what kind of hearings are we going to face? Do you expect the Republicans are going to be in charge? You're less likely to apply your voice to Donald Trump. And notice, by the way, when they suspended him, they were like, we're going to suspend him for like 2 years? Which as a practical matter means we will revisit this after the next election. And again, not to, so I don't sound too cynical on this, if I worked for Facebook, or I guess Meta, like that's basically what I would have recommended strategically. Like, what is in our company's interest? They don't need to work, like their fear has never been competition because they get to buy up their competitors. What they fear is regulation. So as a company, don't tease the bear. Or don't poke the bear. So like under that, like we had these companies being relatively more transparent with researchers and also putting more money into trust and safety. During the techlash years, when it seemed like there was public demand for trust and safety, and both parties were saying, what the hell? And now, over the past few years, as one party has decided, no, we're going to do the Twitter files, we're going to insist that conservative voices are being suppressed, and trust and safety is the problem. The companies have said, what we should do is not spend money on that because we get yelled at. So they're doing less. They're just acting as corporate actors. They're information monopolies, so that's a problem. So like I feel like that's a response to your question, but I'm not sure if it's an upstream or downstream response. So put that where you want to put it.
Francesca?
I didn't want to cut. Did you want to go? You still have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a great question. So this is, I don't know how based in logic this is, but it's more like here that January 6th was a test, right, for a reform of democracy. And that this coming election, I know a lot of people freaked out about it, that what is the possibility of something like this happening, but it actually being successful based on what it was in the period?
Do any of us have better intel than most others at this point?
I think the fact that the writers are in jail, that at least many of them are in jail, helps.
The organizational structures are weakened. So you think about Proud Boys, right? They're very important actors in that space in terms of organizing, mobilizing, planning, the tactical kind of front end. So having some of those leaders jailed helps, I think. But unfortunately, there are probably other organizations and other actors that are planning what the next January, whatever, right? Maybe it's the 6th, maybe it's the 20th, maybe it's not, maybe it's the day of the election, right? Who knows? But I am very, very worried about and I don't think I'm alone at all, actually, in that, in thinking about what either a Trump win looks like or what a Trump loss looks like as we walk into those final days of the election.
So I just had a quick follow-up to that comment.
My dad's bunker is available to me.
Just kind of follow up to that. So what I'm kind of hearing is like, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. Like we're gonna have to face this problem head on regardless of the outcome of the election.
Well, so there'll be a problem, but how big the problem is, like, there's a difference between a handful of guys with guns being mad
Yeah.
and like the sacking of the Capitol, right? Like, a thing that the January 6th rioters thought would happen was that all of the cops would have their back. And they didn't. I'm worried that this time they will, but like there must be some form of bad. Like we're not at a stage in any story where like everything just goes great with no drama. But the scale of bad, this is also why it probably matters a lot that Donald Trump on his campaign trail is talking about how they're martyrs, right? Like that's bad. So it could be very big bad or it could be small bad. Let's hope for small. And I think scale matters a lot. We have sunny. But yeah, like, could be mess. That could be good.
So something that surprised me recently was like the role Truth Social ended up playing in subsidizing Trump's ability to stay afloat, right? You know, that's great. And I think it was fascinating because we were all kind of joking about Truth Social in terms of really, like in terms of its like power relative to things like Twitter, and then you have Twitter, and so I just was wondering if any of you wanted to talk a little bit about, because I hadn't even, it blew my mind, and I was wondering if any of you were as surprised as I was, or if some of you were like, duh, and where did you see that? Because I just was, I didn't see that coming, and I felt embarrassed that I asked.
Well, but let's be clear on the way that it's matter. Like, it's not mattering in the way that we study social media.
Right.
Like, it doesn't matter as a social media.
No, she said that.
It matters as a stack that is now getting traded on the markets,
Yeah.
which means that foreign investors can just hand money to the market,
Yeah.
which like I a little bit, I was a little less surprised by that just because I've been reading a lot of Matt Levine's newsletter and he does a good job of explaining weird market things.
Yeah.
And since my project has been, the past few years has been on tech, like if you spend all your time looking at things like the Bitcoin boom and bust and then boom again, you spend a lot of time being like, oh, markets are weird fiction. So in that sense, I was like, oh, we're having a markets are weird fiction day, but now for Donald Trump. But like that collision of like Truth Social is just a vessel for people to pump billions of dollars over to Donald Trump in ways that would be illegal, but now it's the stock market, so not really the kind, like,
Yeah.
It's the perfect understanding to me of that, the perfect vehicle.
And Greg, can I ask
How this fits into your model of media organizations as political organizations?
They mentioned foreign money. Newsmax got foreign investment from Saudi Arabia. And I see the parallel here. So, yeah, it is very partisan.
so everyone should read Matt Levine's newsletter.
Are journalists writing about this and this a lot? Like,
But it's finance journalists as opposed to political journalists.
Exactly, which is actually what makes it better. You know, because they're not funneling into like this.
The newsletter, I'm like, newsletters have been extremely helpful for this. I'm not even sure it's necessarily.
You've been waiting patiently. Yeah.
So this is kind of a question building on what you just kind of talked about. Like, if they didn't have the super PACs with foreign investors, like how are they making, like, are they still making money? I'm just kind of like asking the business model, right? Is like, because I'm looking at like some platforms like Gab or whatever, right? And those aren't just, it feels like they're not sustainable as business models. And I'm like, how are you making money? And whenever you look at the documents, you're like, still like very confused. Like obviously.
Isn't the head of Gabby's making his own financial system? right? Isn't that his
Kind of,
mission?
right, but he also is now trying to implement like making them pay to post because the infrastructure is increasingly, and they're like, whoa, why would we?
Why would
pay
we do
to-
that?
Yeah, we can just go anywhere else, and I'm like, that's interesting. I mean, I just saw a news story about that, that's not definitive ever, but I'm just kind of asking, you seem like you actually have an understanding about these like larger news organizations, or larger to me, because Gab feels small sometimes, but like these larger, news organizations, like what is their business model if you take away the kind of like money that's getting pumped from super PACs or like from foreign investors, for people who are not like, can they make money? Yeah, thanks for the great question. Very few right-wing media are publicly traded companies, right? So kind of difficult to think how much money they make. So usually I rely on investigative support. The journalists, for example, the Saudi Arabia's money going into Newsmax was from a journal. I think Fox News definitely makes a lot of money. Everybody knows that. But I think it will be misleading to extrapolate that to every other major right and say this media sector makes a lot of money. I don't think that's true. Breitbart struggled a lot after 2016 and in 2017 because of the boycott against it. So it lost a lot of advertisers. Steve Bannon himself admitted that he was losing money. And Daily Wire is very successful, I would say, very successful. So it depends. The New York Post, also based on a report, only started to make money, I think, like 2 years ago. Over the past few decades, it has been losing money. National Review has been losing money. But Daily Caller's, at least for the first few years, the major funder of Daily Caller, Foster Friess, said that it's okay we're not making money, as long as we are changing the conversation. So the journalist Li Fan interviewed him, and he said that. So that was a quote. So I think it's important to emphasize that even if they lose money, there are these important financial backers, billionaire donors on the political right that are willing to continuously support them, fund them, to keep them afloat over many decades. I think that is a critical part of this story, how right-wing media work, how they operate.
I want to draw a parallel to the nonprofit world for a minute. Because when right-wing media is losing money, we have to understand that that is an expenditure in order to give voice to the perspective. Right, like this is a thing. I come out of the nonprofit world. Like there's fewer left-wing billionaires in the world, but also left-wing billionaires are giving charitable money to make the world more like their ideals. Right-wing billionaires are often investing money in organizations that are going to help them to be less taxed. That is a different type of activity, right? So if their publications are losing money, like that quote is surprising that he said it on the record, but that's entirely unsurprising because as opposed to a billionaire going, I'm going to prop up this nice civil society sporting journal. I hope eventually make money so I don't have to spend money on all of it. Like that's because they're thinking that it's charitable giving, not as an expenditure for the project that helps make money. Right? Like we're seeing the same thing in media organizations, and you should be unsurprised. Like, of course, Gab isn't going to be directly profitable, but so long as it is helping to further the goals of we are going to be less regulated and less taxed, that's a fair expenditure. Like that's going to help them make more money, and that's just what they're trying to do. Like it's rational.
So I think this is a really nice way for us to wrap up the discussion that we've been having here. Clearly, I think one of the take-home points of this discussion has been that as we're looking at media and their impact on political events, socio-political world, that we've got to expand our understanding of what their roles and purposes and functions are within that environment. That too often we have gone in with the assumptions that these are rational economic actors, right, that are operating to generate profit, and how is this, just think about this sort of stupefaction, right, the wonder, the question marks that we all had when Musk took over Twitter and immediately started losing money, and everybody was predicting, oh, it's just gonna shut down. But he's kept it going, though he admits it is money losing losing money hand over fist. These empirical realities are so in our faces, yet as a sort of amalgamation of larger disciplines, I think we're losing that point. And it's something that we need to focus on quite a bit more, understanding that there are multiple logics. There is not a single media logic. There are multiple logics, and we need to better understand those and share, right, those logics with others going forward. So I hope you all will take a second to join me in thanking our outstanding panelists. Thank you to the audience for having a really great conversation.
We have a 30-minute break, and then we'll be back. So stretch, get some sunlight, have some snacks or drinks, and we'll be back at 3 o'clock.
Thank you for asking that, man.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good.